And I'm trying to decide how many times I want to walk up and down these stairs today. And so I thought, I'll just get back down here. Yep. Since I'm going to be singing down here when I'm done with a little help. It is good to be with you. I have to confess I had lots of thoughts and reflections regarding being here this Sunday, as well as the text, and they both brought me a certain amount of uncomfortableness. Not because I don't know you, not because I don't know the text, but certainly with respect to my own uncomfortableness, some of it begins with the fact that it has been so long. There's that familiarity, but I know time passes. You know time passes. You're seeing me wander around here. I'm leaning ever more on that cane that I've got going on, and I can see that I'm not the only one. The fact is that our lives move and change, and sometimes things that were once familiar start to take on an air of wonder and wondering, will things be the same? Do I know enough about what's happening up at Holy Cross to bring a message from the Lord that is relevant and pertinent to your lives? Well, thank God that's not all of me, and some of that, indeed all of that, is on God. Well, to some degree, I had sort of the same sense about that text, Exodus chapter 14. Why chapter 14? You know, there's a certain sense of familiarity. Yes, we all remember that from Sunday school. Yeah, the Israelites are leaving Egypt. They're escaping. The Lord is leading them by that pillar of fire. And yet, there's something disturbing about the text that I didn't really settle into, I think, in Sunday school. You know, I was realizing just how bad a general it seemed that Moses, and therefore God, was, having led his people out into the wilderness and backed them up against the Red Sea that they couldn't get across, with no other escape and nothing to defend them but a pillar of cloud and fire. You know, if I was a soldier, I would be pretty upset at the general that stuck me in that spot. You know, strategically, it made no sense. God's people seemingly had won the victory anyway, and on top of that, it seems to make no sense that they've gone out into the wilderness, they've escaped Egypt. And what is this crazy Pharaoh guy doing still chasing them? I thought we were done with them. I thought it was over. I thought it was all said and done. And we are going to be free, and we are going to be going, and we're going places, and everything is going to be good. And maybe that too speaks to your life, because I can tell you I've had that experience more than once. That big, thank God, Egypt is over. Now I can get on to, well, kicking back and taking it easy and enjoying life with God. Did that work out for you? I know it didn't work out for me. No, it didn't seem to go that way. And indeed, for as much as this text today seems to be a great victory, if we know the story, we know it's just a segue. The grumbling that has already begun, the voices that clamor and scream, God, why did you bring us out here into this desert to die? They begin here, but they don't end here. The journey of God's people goes on. So what is it, the significance then of this victory? Is it just a moment where we can sit down and say, oh, good, God wins sometimes? Or is it deeper? Is it more profound than that? And does it challenge our ideas of what it means for God to win? You know, this passage through the Red Sea is just part of a journey, but in a certain sense, it is a crescendo of the first part of the book of Exodus. The real crescendo actually comes in chapter 15, where if I had that chapter 15 text, we could all sing camp songs about the horse and rider falling into the sea. But it's still the end of this story that begins at the beginning, of God's people coming into Egypt. It begins clear back with Joseph, as you heard last Sunday. It begins clear back with God rescuing his people in Egypt by giving them a place and providing for them and establishing everything that they needed in order to continue being God's people. Maybe not everything they wanted. Indeed, we know quickly that will turn from the successes of Joseph to that ominous text that is there at the beginning of the book of Exodus that says, "And then rose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph." And the story begins. A story of failed hospitality. A nation, Egypt, that began as a hospitable friend to the people of Israel, the people of God, just as Joseph and Mary in our gospel lesson were told to go find this hospitable friend, but they were at least good enough that they managed to get out before the hospitality ended, right? They are told very shortly after going to Egypt, a couple of years will pass, and they can come back home, but not all the way home to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, but rather to Nazareth. And this story of the journey of the Christ begins. The story of the journey of God's people began there with that Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. And that time they spent in exile. That time they spent not just being guests in someone's house, but having their host turn on them that they might be slaves. Folks whose houses were not adorned with reminders of who God is, but reminders of who the gods of Egypt are and who the Pharaoh is. No, this story of who God is for God's people gets this beginning here, and it walks us through that exile. And then it walks us through the 10 plagues, right? The plagues on the people, those plagues that remind us with each plague about the gods of Egypt and their inability to do what God can do for God's people. And finally, we find ourselves here at the side of the Red Sea, wondering, were we out here in faith? Were we out here in a relationship with God, or were we just chasing fool's gold? Can God really stand up to the gods of heaven and earth, to the man Pharaoh who calls himself God, and ultimately to that instrument of that God Pharaoh, as he calls himself, his mighty army? The army that goes and enslaves people all the time to build the pyramids and add to the numbers of the Israelites in Egypt. And we are left wondering, God, did you bring us in our lives to this place? And what would it mean for you to have victory in our lives? And some of us want to look at that text and we think, I see God wins. And we hold on to that as we should. Yes, God wins, but I want to bring you into the circumstances of God's victory. Did you notice that all hope was lost? Did you notice that the grumbling had begun? Did you notice that how God rescues them ends up being this thing that no human could have engineered? Did you notice that God did this not just for the people to slip away in the night, but there might be a sign of how great God is, that there might be a witness to who God is, that God loves his people, and God will avenge those who have done wrong. This text is full of this notion of how hospitality has failed and how the worst circumstances happened, and Pharaoh's army has chased his guests, what were his guests, out in the desert to re-enslave them in this horrible sign. And yet God's people, the kind of people that oftentimes want to stand up for themselves and say, God, is it time for me to get up and fight? Is it time for me to get up and stand up and do what is right? Is it time for me? And yet, at the side of the Red Sea, even the bravest, even the strongest warriors, even those who might have been most leaned upon to catch a great victory for God, knew they were outgunned, knew that they were outnumbered, knew that all was lost, if not for God and God's vengeance. And you know how this story turns, right? Moses is called then to make this sign and to spread his arms. You know, we can all in our minds see Charlton Heston there in the movies, right? With his staff, and he's standing on the big rock, and we get this sense that, well, at least there was a great man to do this thing. But that's not what the text is telling us. Moses was just a man doing what God said. He didn't have the power to spread the seas, but God did. And the seas spread that day. And the people suddenly seeing their way out and probably having great misgivings, wondering, is that wall of water going to land on the side of me? Maybe as if one was kind of in a construction zone, kind of wondering, hey, have they put the sides of this thing up strong enough that they're going to stand up while I run through there? And they start, and they pass through, and they get to the other side, and God has done this great thing, and Pharaoh's armies, in the ultimate arrogance, say, we too can do this. And we find them in their ultimate humiliation and their ultimate powerlessness before God. As they don't die fighting with their spears and running with their chariots, they die trying to pry their horses and their chariots out of the muck and mud like common refugees. You see, this text is reminding us of who God is as the one who takes the lowliest and the lowest and raises them up, and takes the greatest and the highest and those who would think they are the most powerful and brings them low and says, no, I will be Lord alone. You know, in our lives, I know certainly for myself, I spend lots of time planning, lots of time making arrangements so that certain things happen and my family will be protected, and there'll be stuff over my head, and there'll be, food on the table, and all those things that we need that we all find ourselves caught up in. Those things that speak to our lives, because that's how our lives in this world work. Try not paying your bills for a while. Some of us have had to do that because of health problems or other sorts of things, and you know that, well, life gets pretty ugly and pretty complicated pretty fast, doesn't it? And yet, God says, even in a world like that, I am still God, and I will provide. We are reminded in this great sign, as in so many of them that we hear over and over again, of this God who anywhere he takes his people, whether that be the Sinai Desert or Brigham City, Utah, wherever God takes his people, he is still God there. And we find ourselves clinging to that, reminded that we no longer have to defend ourselves and have to worry over every little thing. God will provide. You and I know sometimes that's complicated. Sometimes that means changes in our lives where our accustomed standard of living, or the things we were used to doing, or the things maybe just simply that we used to do, are no longer accessible to us, God still provides. That is our word. That is our word for today. That is our reminder, not just in our Old Testament lesson, but in our gospel lesson, as threatened with his very life, God provides for his son and his family. And though it's not the expectations of the Messiah, God will change the world through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, just as he did, starting that relationship with his people in the Old Testament, as he brought them out of Egypt. Have no other gods before me, for I am the only one. May it be so in our lives. This day, tomorrow, and every day, whatever challenges God brings before us. In Jesus' name, amen.